I spend my time advising sort of fashion and retail businesses around the world on how to find growth. I will admit that is a topic that is becoming harder and harder, but actually that excites me rather than scares me, because I think while the landscape is becoming harsh, and it is really hard trading environment, and it is really hard to find growth, I think this is a perfect time for innovation. So I think we are already seeing really exciting models emerging. They're not really at scale yet in many cases, but we are about to go through a period of time where I think we're going to see really exciting innovation in the models and the way we do stuff. Because fundamentally, in my view, just doing more of what we're doing slightly better isn't going to cut it anymore. And so I'm actually really excited about the sort of, what on one level is quite a depressing landscape, but on the other level I think is going to create some really exciting things coming forward. So thank you for inviting me to share some of those perspectives with you. I'll sort of zoom all the way out and come a little bit closer to home over the course of the presentation, but just to give you the sort of state of the nation to some extent. The retail environment is tough. I don't need to tell you that, but in terms of just the level of volatility we're seeing around the globe, whether that is sort of geopolitical volatility, whether it's stock market volatility, we are bucking the long-term trends, so we really are in a more volatile time than we've ever been. That has translated consistently into deterioration in consumer confidence, and although we are on an uptick to some extent, we're nowhere near the long-term average still. And despite the uptick, the sort of challenge is historically kind of increases in consumer confidence have translated into spending. Some of that correlation is broken, and it's particularly broken in retail. So consumers are now choosing to spend more on experiences than they are products. And so again, the sort of landscape from a retail and a fashion perspective means it is hard to convince people that they need and want and will spend their money on product at the moment. Within that, fashion and apparel specifically has been hit quite hard, and there's a few different dynamics around that, one of which is stagnation of volume growth. So for years, we've enjoyed market growth, and that market growth has been fueled by volume increases as we buy more, and also price increases. But looking forward now, we're into a world of pretty much volume stagnation. And so there will be market growth, but that's primarily going to be price-driven. And so what that practically means is we are in a world of share gain rather than volume growth for most players. And again, that sort of increases the sort of importance of being great in this market. The bad news doesn't stop there. That is coming for the first time ever at the same time as effectively cost increases and margin pressure. So the chart on the right-hand side there just shows the sort of deterioration or the expected deterioration in margin if cost inflations continue as they are. So we are in, for the first time ever, in a period where there is both pressure on the top line and the bottom line. And for me, again, as I say, there is an interpretation here, which is it's all doom and gloom. But actually, I think this is exactly the reason we're going to see really interesting innovation, because you can't just keep doing the same old thing and expect better results. We are going to have to start to do some things differently. Within that macro context, and lots of these things have been referenced throughout the sort of conversation today, but I thought it might be helpful to pull it all together. There are some other structural trends that are really key, and I think are going to likely be some of the sources of the innovation and the opportunities that we're going to see down the line. So each of these will sort of step through very briefly in turn. The first of which is resale. And personally, I'm very excited about this. I think it's really interesting evolution of an omni-channel model, actually. And in the UK, the resale market is estimated to be around 8 billion already. It's similar in other key Western markets in particular. Practically, what that means is today, about 1 in 4 transactions go through resale. I'm just going to pause there because everyone always thinks that's massive. It is. So about 25% of transactions are already going through resale, yet very few people are playing in that space today. So one of the big questions, I think, for the industry is, how do I play in this ecosystem? Where do I play? Do I partner with people? Do I need, how do I get a piece of this sort of transaction volume that's going through? My other sort of favorite stat on this is if we go back to the volume growth chart a few seconds ago, I said there isn't any volume growth in the market. That's true of the first-hand market. If you add back the resale volume on top, you get back to about the 2% volume growth we've seen historically. So again, practically what that means is consumer behavior hasn't actually changed that much in terms of the amount of product we're consuming. We've just shifted it out of the first-hand channel into the second-hand channel, and are now doing that in a sort of much more organic way. I think other super interesting things about the sort of motivations for resale, it isn't about sustainability. That's sort of a secondary factor. Most consumers are buying resale for value for money, and that is the primary reason. I can buy something, I'm more confident, I'm going to get more for my money, and I'm sort of happier about that experience. The next sort of factor that people quote is then actually the treasure hunting aspect. So I feel good about getting a bargain. So if you think about some of the drug we're hooked on in the first-hand market, which is, oh, I love to get a discount, we're getting a different sort of hit of that same drug, but in the resale market, where I discover something, I feel great that I found a treasure that no one else has found but me. And so it's really tapping into lots of the sort of evolutions that we are seeing in the first-hand market, but in a sort of much better way through the resale channel. The other piece that I find really interesting and sort of speaks to some of that value for money trade-off is that most people assume that resale is primarily about premium product. It isn't. People are just as likely to buy mass or value brands effectively than they are to go for sort of premium or luxury products. So that top chart is listings on Vinted at a moment in time. So you can see a big range of mass and value brands there. However, that's also translating into transactions. So that middle chart then shows you which brands are you most likely to buy. Slightly more premium, potentially, or slightly more mass than value, but next, M&S, Primark, Zara, H&M, those are the most popular brands to be bought through Vinted, not just listed through Vinted. So it's absolutely part of the everyday repertoire and not just about picking up sort of single premium pieces. So I think as we think about the sort of evolution of the landscape, resale is here already. And so I think there's really interesting opportunity there in terms of how do we tap into that, how do we make it part of the omni-channel ecosystem, and brands really working on and thinking hard about how we maximize this sort of opportunity. It would be unfair to talk about structural change without talking about not only channel change, but also the massive change in competitive landscape. So there's no denying that Shein and Temu have redefined some of the landscape. They've come in very quickly, and they've shown us that consumers are willing to make a different trade-off across price, quality, convenience, fashion than we might have traditionally expected 5 or 10 years ago. And they're doing that very effectively, whether we like the model or not. The scale and the sort of acceleration of the growth has been pretty phenomenal, and you can see Shein at the bottom here is the major player in most Western markets again, or most large fashion markets. So it is resonating with the consumer, and absolutely a sort of real shift in the competitive intensity and the considerations that we see in the fashion market more broadly. I think there are probably 4 key elements to that, which I think mostly are quite well understood. But again, thinking about where the opportunities might lie within a pretty tough environment, some of them sort of lie in some of the ways that they have approached the market and done things a little bit differently. The first is sort of data-powered inventory management. So the pure sort of data-led approach that they have, the short lead times, the AI that they've built into their inventory management that allows them to flex up and down their production very quickly based on external factors and inputs in the data that they are gathering all of the time, means that they are obviously best in class in terms of that sort of ultra-fast, ultra-flexible inventory management type system. We've talked quite a bit about the AI prediction and the personalization today. Again, that is where they have done a great job, obviously, of capturing and using the data in terms of personalization and prediction, where they are using, obviously, personalized recommendations. You can pop in a picture of any product you like. They will serve you up the options they have on their own site. So they are making it as easy and as personal as they can as a sort of first step in that direction. Another key element, however, is the UX. And again, they have really pushed forward on effectively the fun and the engaging and effectively the gamification of the sort of retail interaction. And to some extent also nudged forward the sort of loyalty mechanics that we sort of see in this market. So whether it is, when you log into the app, in fact, you get points for just logging in on a daily basis. You don't actually have to buy anything, so you can kind of build up points and credit that way. So it's not just about transaction behavior, it's about your broader interaction and behavior with the sites. Or whether it's about that sort of gamification and the sort of discounts that you get off the back of that. But the experience is engaging and fun and keeps people coming back time and time again. And then we've sort of had a much better sort of representation of this just now, but that sort of community element and that sort of engagement with sort of social channels has been critical. Their sort of presence on TikTok is huge, and it has enabled them to operate at a much lower cost base effectively than a traditional sort of fashion retailer would. So I think that sort of Chinese disruption or the evolution in the competitive landscape has sort of totally step changed the sort of basis on which we are competing, but I think there's lots of really interesting areas that we could pull on to sort of continue that sort of theme of innovation. Another big sort of structural shift that we are, or certainly I'm seeing lots of my clients sort of worry about now, is effectively worrying about a refocus on brand. And over the last 15 years, we've had a really interesting shift from roughly 15 years ago, where we had 80% of our marketing spend was on brand marketing, through to today, where roughly 80% of our marketing is on performance marketing. And that's a very logical evolution. Performance marketing is much easier to track. You get a nice ROI. It makes lots of sense. But actually what you can see alongside this is a real erosion in brand engagement, brand trust, and brand loyalty. And so what we've created now is this treadmill where we are constantly buying transactions. We're not building relationships with consumers. That's really impacting customer lifetime value. And that's coming at the same time as CAC obviously increasing and in cost inflation, et cetera. And so there's a rebalance to be had here around what is the right level of brand and brand communication versus performance marketing and optimization. And likely, most people think there's a sort of shift back towards probably more of a 50-50 type mindset. But it's not just about the spend. So as I sort of said right at the beginning, the sort of top line pressure or the volume growth means this becomes increasingly about share gain rather than a sort of volume growth challenge for most people. And a share gain means you've got to be better than the next person. And you've got to find your customer and you've got to convince them that you are the right choice in this sort of right occasion. And the current market is quite crowded. So if you think about the market just on the traditional sort of price and quality perception metrics, what you find in almost every market around the world is a massive cluster in the middle. And that is a very dangerous place to be, because if you are undifferentiated on those dimensions, you need to be really clear on why else someone would come to you. People have obviously done it. Zara is a great example in the middle here. Obviously, the reason you go is they've got the right balance of price and quality, but they've got the style and the fashion, and you know that, and you trust that, and that's where you go. Uniqlo have done another great job of elevating themselves out of that sort of middle of the pack sort of peer set by really focusing on quality, on fabrication, and about the technical elements of their garments, and there is value in that, and the consumer recognizes that, and that becomes their USP. That's what they talk about, etc. But again, sort of the refocus on brand is another sort of critical element, because in a world of share gain rather than just volume growth, being really clear on why you're not stuck in the middle and you're doing something fundamentally different is going to make the difference, or all the difference, I think, in the success of a brand in this market. Another piece of the sort of shift in the dynamics of the market, which I think we've touched on in loads of sort of other themes today, but is omni-channel. And omni-channel is absolutely here to stay. So if you think about resale as part of that sort of ecosystem, it's only expanding more and more in terms of what we mean by sort of an ecosystem and a sort of omni-channel way of working. But we have broadly seen the plateauing of digital penetration. So over the last few years, and I think I've missed 25 off this chart, but we are still broadly plateaued at around 40 to 45%, depending on what sort of categories you're in, of online penetration across this sort of apparel market. And again, there's not much more growth to come. We think that's likely the sort of level that the market has now settled at. That is proving really tough for online pure plays, as you can see in most of the results, because those natural sort of tailwinds are now played out. And they're having to go back and think about really back to sort of the basics, and some of the omni-channel players are therefore picking up more of the growth. What we see in the omni-channel dynamics is broadly volume sort of has maintained, but they've still got the cost pressure coming through, and in particular the additional cost pressure of running stores and labor, etc. So neither place is an easy one to be, but that system is sort of settled down now, and I think a general acceptance that omni-channel is the preference, and I'll show you some consumer data on that in a second as well. But the other key component here that's worth calling out is the other real benefit of an omni-channel approach is that sort of call out that it's really pretty consistent now, particularly in the UK. It varies a bit by geography, but about 15% of online sales can be attributed to store and physical presence. So the mantra 5 years ago used to be, if you close a store, it's fine, we'll pick up those sales online. We now know that's absolutely not true. It works the other way. You close your store, you lose online sales in that catchment. So it really is a very symbiotic relationship between the two. I sort of promised to talk a little bit about kind of consumer preferences on omni-channel. This, and forgive the consulting charts, but this top chart just shows you consumer ratings in the UK by pure play and by multi-channel. So very simply just thinking about sort of the different types of retailers, and relatively consistently since about 2017, at an aggregate level, consumers have preferred multi-channel propositions over online pure plays. And that gap is actually widening. So in the most recent sort of years of data that we have, actually there is an increasing preference towards multi-channel players. Part of that reason, which is on the bottom chart, is trust. One of the biggest indicators of how much a sort of consumer likes a brand or not is how much they trust them. And the sort of next level of factors are sort of secondary to that. But you can see that bottom red line, the sort of trust. There is a bigger and bigger gap emerging between the trust of pure players versus the trust of multi-channel players, and that is playing through in terms of the overall perception. The other really interesting sort of line I find is the dark blue line on that bottom chart, which is historically one of the things that has been the real sort of heartland of a pure play has been the ease of shopping and the convenience of that shopping. That, from a consumer perspective, is eroding. So we are almost at the point where omni-channel players are seen as easy to shop as a pure play. And so again, there's sort of this shift towards a more of an ecosystem mindset, more of an omni-channel mindset is continuing to play into the preferences of the consumer. I'll keep going. Another big structural shift, primarily sort of enabled by digital, but that has been sort of shaping the way businesses operate as much as how consumers think about the landscape, is effectively globalization. So most scale brands today are global or at least international. Very practically, that means you're probably in Europe in 8 to 12 different markets. Historically, you've been able to get to scale within a single market, and that just doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And the reason this is particularly important in terms of the sort of fashion landscape and structure is the complexity that injects into your operating model and more of the things we have to deal with. So thinking about the balance between how much of your operations are global and you push out everywhere versus how much are you localizing in order to really activate and react at the local level in a local market. All of those are sort of balancing acts that the business needs to deal with and needs to deal with through basically every function in the business. And so part of the challenge around sort of cost inflation is actually a lot of it is driven by complexity inflation by business, by having more channels, but also more geographies that we are increasingly having to deal with in order to be at scale. And the sort of final point I was just going to pick up on in terms of sort of trends and themes is supply chain. And I don't think you can't talk about structural shift in the fashion industry without talking about supply chain. But whether it is sort of the pressure of shorter lead times, or whether it is the need to be more transparent and more traceable, or whether it is the geopolitical instability, or indeed the sort of evolution of tariffs and what that may or may not bring, actually supply chains are having to evolve probably the most rapidly out of any part of the business at the moment. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, but the key thing that we are definitely seeing consistently is agility. So building more agility into the supply chain, de-risking by having multiple geographies. Potentially, H&M have now actually moved their supply chains to be regional, so they effectively operate 3 different supply chains for Europe, for the US, for Asia. So really building in more flexibility, more optionality into the supply chain has become the most critical component for most businesses at the moment. Again, introducing complexity, but also a huge shift in how we do stuff that impacts all the way up through the entire operating model and the entire value chain. So it is a tough environment, but there are people finding growth, and this is just looking at the sort of evolution in sort of share position for Europe and the US, and you can sort of clearly see Shein, obviously, the sort of biggest gain, but Zara also doing a good job despite the tough conditions, finding ways of innovating, doing things differently, evolving, staying most relevant for the consumer, and making sure that they are continuing to serve consumers in the way they want to be served. In the UK specifically, it's actually Next and JD Sport that are doing the best job. So they've done the best job of gaining share over this period, which I think is also particularly interesting in the context of it's also possible for a multi-branded retailer to resonate and to be able to build that trust and to be able to capture the share from the consumer. So I think good examples of both branded but also retail examples that despite it feeling like doom and gloom, there are still opportunities to gain share and to grow. Linking it back a little bit to the broader conversation that we've had sort of throughout the day today, technology plays a massive part, I think, in the innovation and the evolution and what the next sort of business model will look like. It's unanimous, sort of all of my clients, certainly I speak to, know that technology needs to take a real step forward. People are increasing, not decreasing their budgets, but I think the question remains, and some of the great sort of conversation today has been around where do you really invest that? And where can you really make a difference? The other side of that coin that we are definitely seeing from a business environment as well is that the sort of consumer and the business landscape has never been as ready to receive the technology and the data and the information and the sort of shift in ways of working than it is now. So whether it is the sort of breadth of data that we now capture, not just transactional, but behavioral and predictive, et cetera, the sort of accessibility of solutions and the fact the cost is coming down significantly versus even 5 years ago, whether it is automation, whether it is sort of systems unification. I think the landscape from a business and consumer perspective has never been more ready to sort of innovate and make that shift, which is exciting. And because if you hadn't guessed already, I love data. I do like this chart in particular, which just sort of shows the amount of data we have been capturing, and the fact that over the next 3 to 4 years, we're just going to double the amount of data we are capturing. And for me, that screams opportunity. Just think about what we can do with all of that information if we have the right tools and we ask the right questions and we apply it in the right way. But this gets me really excited about that innovation and that opportunity of what's to come. I'm going to talk about this very briefly because I think others today have done a much, much better job of talking to this. But again, where we sort of see people applying that technology really kind of goes back to some of those themes and trends that are shaping the landscape. So personalization is one of the big themes in terms of how do I just be more relevant? How do I get to the place where I am gaining share, not losing share? Profitability, as my costs increase, how on earth do I get to a place where I am just back to a more comfortable way of operating and at a margin that is sustainable for the long term, both for me as a business, but also in terms of the value I can give to the consumer? Sustainability is another kind of key area. How do I make sure I'm traceable and I'm responsible and I'm doing things in the way that I really want to be doing and I'm confident in doing that? And then productivity, which obviously links closely to the profitability, but how can I do more with less? And how can I be smart and efficient about how I do that and offer, again, the best possible value to my teams, but also to the consumer? So those are the sort of key areas where we are seeing people really investing their time and energy in that evolution. And I'll end on this slide, which I always find is slightly disappointing, because in all of that context, I don't have the answer for what that silver bullet, innovative, sort of future operating model is. But I certainly, for those that were around for the conversation or the sort of presentation that Azim gave earlier, one of the things that really resonated with me was him calling out Ford and the shift from electricity, having electricity as the light bulb or having electricity as the shift in the operating model. And I think in any one of those individual sort of areas that we've talked about, there are lots of really great light bulbs to be had. But the thing that gets me most excited is what are the evolutions in the operating model that are going to fundamentally shift and change how we deliver fashion to people. And I don't have the answer to that question, but I do think we've got increasingly a good idea of what the key components are. So it's got to be close to the customer. It's got to understand the customer. It's got to, really lean into kind of customer dynamics. I think it has got to be circular and sustainable. I don't think that necessarily means everything is sort of circular, but it's got to have elements of that within the operating model for sure. It has to be tech and AI enabled. It is hard to see that future sort of operating model doesn't have a huge dose of more automation, more AI, smarter working. It's got to be purpose-led at the same time, though. People have high expectations back to how are you going to win share, and it links in with the sort of values obsessed. How are you going to win share with the consumer? How are you going to convince people to shop with you? But also, how are you going to attract the best possible talent? And I think those two components are going to be absolutely critical. And maybe where something like the Chinese disruptors are falling down, they might have solved the efficiency parts of this equation, but I don't believe they've yet solved the brand engagement, the purpose, and the values part of the equation that I think is going to be critical in the future. I think it's going to be collaborative. I don't think you can do it all on your own. I think there is too much complexity, there is too much going on, you cannot be the expert at everything, and so I think it is absolutely going to involve partnering with people in ways we may not have thought we would partner, but that will make it better for everyone involved. And the final piece of the puzzle is I think it's going to be diversified, so just relying on single revenue streams, just like we now don't rely on single sources for production, and we are moving to multi-geography sort of models so that we are de-risking our sort of revenue streams in that way. I think we are going to see an evolution in our revenue streams. We're already seeing it with some things like retail media, for example, alternative revenue streams that aren't just linked to this season we're going to sell more product than we sold last season, because I think that's just not a model that's going to work in the future. So I don't have the answers, but I am willing to bet that most of these components will be in whatever the answer is when it emerges over the next sort of 3 to 5 years.